June 1944. While one man commanded a phantom army that existed only on paper, another man prepared to launch the greatest invasion in human history. Adolf Hitler believed the lie. And because he did, tens of thousands of young soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy had a fighting chance to survive. The spring rain hammered against the windows of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London. Inside, General Dwight Eisenhower sat alone in his office, staring at a single sheet of paper that could save or doom 500,000 men. The paper contained a lie. Not just any lie. The most elaborate, most dangerous, most consequential deception ever conceived in the history of warfare. If it worked, the Allies would liberate Europe. If it failed, the English Channel would run red with American blood. Eisenhower picked up his pen, hesitated for just a moment, then signed his name. Operation Fortitude was now official. The Allies were about to fight World War II's most important battle not with bullets and bombs, but with make-believe. And at the center of this massive deception stood one of the generals Hitler feared most, a commander whose reputation alone could influence the movement of entire German armies. A general who would not command a single combat unit during the most critical week of the entire war. A general named George S. Patton. The story of how America fooled Hitler begins not in the war rooms of London, but inside the calculating mind of the Nazi dictator himself, and with his assessment of one particular American commander. George Patton was everything Hitler pretended to be but wasn't. Born to a wealthy California family with deep military roots, Patton had been bred for battle from childhood. He'd competed in the 1912 Olympics, chased Pancho Villa across Mexico, commanded tanks in World War I, and spent 20 years between the wars studying the art of mechanized warfare while other officers played golf. By 1944, at age 58, Patton was the most aggressive, most successful, most feared field commander in the American military. He wore ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, spoke in a gravelly growl, cursed like a longshoreman, and believed with absolute conviction that he was the reincarnation of ancient warriors stretching back to Carthage. His soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts. The Germans called him Der Bluthund, the Bloodhound. And Hitler himself considered Patton among the Allied commanders who truly understood mechanized warfare, one of the few who thought like a German panzer leader. This assessment wasn't unfounded. In July 1943, Patton's 7th Army had stormed across Sicily in just 38 days, covering over 200 miles of hostile territory, capturing thousands of German soldiers, and demonstrating a speed of advance that stunned even his own superiors. German commanders took note. So did Hitler. But in the spring of 1944, Patton was in disgrace. The previous August, visiting wounded soldiers in field hospitals in Sicily, Patton had encountered 2 men with no visible injuries, men diagnosed with what we now call PTSD but what was then dismissed as cowardice. Patton had lost his temper, slapped both soldiers, called them yellow cowards, and threatened to have them shot. When the story leaked to American newspapers, the public outcry nearly ended his career. Eisenhower, who was both Patton's superior and his old friend, faced enormous pressure to send Patton home in disgrace. Members of Congress demanded it. Editorial pages called for it. Even General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff back in Washington, suggested that Patton might have to go. But Eisenhower understood something crucial. Something that would become the foundation of the greatest military deception ever conceived. He understood that Patton's value to the Allied cause might actually be greater if he didn't command real troops. Because while Americans might have soured on Patton after the slapping incident, the Germans hadn't. German intelligence still rated Patton as one of the Allies' most dangerous field commanders. Hitler's military planners still tracked Patton's movements carefully, knowing that wherever Patton went, the main attack would likely follow. And that reputation, Eisenhower realized, could be weaponized. The challenge facing the Allies in early 1944 was brutally simple. Everyone knew an invasion of Europe was coming. The only questions were where and when. The Germans had fortified the entire Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, but they couldn't put their strongest defenses everywhere. They had to guess where the Allies would strike, then concentrate their forces there. The most obvious target was Pas-de-Calais, the narrow stretch of French coastline directly across the English Channel from Dover. It was the shortest route, just 20 miles of water. It offered the straightest path to Germany. It was where any conventional military planner would strike. Which was exactly why Eisenhower planned to invade Normandy, 150 miles to the west, where the beaches were more treacherous but the German defenses were weaker. The plan only worked if Hitler kept his strongest forces in Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Even after the Allies landed in Normandy, even after the first troops were ashore, even after the battle was clearly underway, Hitler needed to believe that Normandy was just a diversion, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The Allies needed Hitler to believe a lie so completely that he would ignore the evidence of his own eyes. This wasn't just a matter of hiding troop movements or maintaining radio silence. The Allies needed to create an entire phantom army, a force so convincing that German reconnaissance planes would photograph it, German spies would report on it, and Hitler himself would reorganize his defensive strategy around stopping it. They needed to create the first United States Army Group, FUSAG for short. And they needed to make Hitler believe it was real. The man chosen to lead this phantom army was one of the few American generals whose name alone carried enough weight with German intelligence to make the deception credible. George S. Patton, the disgraced general whom Hitler's planners watched so carefully, would command an army of ghosts. Operation Fortitude was the cover name for what became the most elaborate deception in military history. It had two parts. Fortitude North would convince Hitler that the Allies planned to invade Norway. Fortitude South would convince him that when the real invasion came, it would strike at Pas-de-Calais, led by Patton and FUSAG. The entire operation was overseen by a British intelligence unit called the London Controlling Section, but the implementation involved thousands of people across dozens of units. They created fake radio traffic mimicking an entire army group. They brought in the best set designers from British film studios to build fake tanks, fake landing craft, fake supply depots. These weren't crude plywood cutouts. They were sophisticated inflatables and metal frames that looked perfect from the air, complete with fake tank tracks leading away from them. They positioned these dummy vehicles in Kent and Sussex, the parts of England closest to Pas-de-Calais. German reconnaissance flights photographed sprawling base camps, massive tank formations, what appeared to be an invasion force of enormous scale preparing to strike across the narrowest part of the channel. But the physical deceptions were only part of the plan. The Allies also ran what intelligence historians still consider one of the most successful double-agent operations ever conducted. Through a combination of skill, luck, and German mistakes, British intelligence had captured or turned every German spy they knew about who was operating in Britain. The Germans didn't realize it, but virtually every intelligence report they received from agents in Britain was actually written by British intelligence officers. These double agents sent back detailed reports about FUSAG. They described Patton inspecting troops. They reported on the insignia patches worn by FUSAG soldiers, patches that British factories produced by the thousands and that Allied soldiers actually wore when they visited the southeast coastal towns. They reported on conversations overheard in pubs, on supply shipments observed, on all the seemingly incidental intelligence that spies gather. And because the reports came from agents the Germans had trusted for years, the Germans believed them. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. FUSAG didn't just need to look real from the air. It needed to sound real on the airwaves. A real army group would generate thousands of radio messages every day, everything from high-level strategic communications to mundane logistics coordination. So the Allies created phantom radio networks. They had operators send messages mimicking the communications patterns of a real army. They used proper call signs, proper procedures, proper encryption. They even included the kinds of mistakes and delays that real radio operators make. German listening posts picked up this traffic and reported what appeared to be a massive Allied army group in southeast England. They intercepted messages about supply shortages, training exercises, requests for replacement parts, all the mundane bureaucratic noise of a real military force. Their direction-finding equipment confirmed the messages were coming from Kent and Sussex. Their analysts concluded FUSAG was real, was growing stronger every day, and was clearly preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. But the entire deception rested on one crucial element, the one piece that would make Hitler believe the lie completely. Patton had to be seen commanding FUSAG. One of the generals Hitler's planners watched most carefully had to be positioned directly across from Pas-de-Calais. Because Hitler's military advisors understood that the Allies wouldn't waste their most aggressive armored commander on a diversion. For Patton, the assignment was both humiliating and excruciating. He was a warrior who lived for combat, a cavalryman born too late who'd found his calling in tank warfare, a man who believed his destiny was to lead armies in great battles. Now he was being asked to sit in England playing make-believe while other generals prepared to lead the actual invasion. He wrote in his diary that the assignment was frustrating and worried that history would remember him as a paper general who'd missed the war's decisive battle. He didn't know, couldn't know, that his role in the deception might save more lives than any battle he could personally fight. Eisenhower made Patton's appointment to FUSAG public. Allied newspapers reported on it. Patton made appearances in southeast England, always carefully photographed and reported. He gave speeches to units of real soldiers temporarily assigned to the FUSAG deception, speeches that German intelligence sources duly reported back to Berlin. The Germans accepted the information. Their intelligence reports in the spring of 1944 confidently identified FUSAG as a primary invasion force. They estimated its strength at nearly 1 million men, almost twice its notional size. Most importantly, they placed Patton in command, and Hitler's military planners positioned their strongest divisions to meet the threat they believed Patton would lead across the Channel at its narrowest point. As May turned to June, as the real invasion force prepared to launch toward Normandy, the deception hung by a thread. One lucky German reconnaissance flight, one unturned spy, one intercepted authentic radio message could unravel everything. If Hitler discovered FUSAG was fake, if he realized Patton was commanding phantoms, he might immediately redeploy his mobile reserves from Calais to Normandy. And if those armored divisions hit the Normandy beaches while American troops were still vulnerable, still establishing their foothold, still bringing supplies and reinforcements ashore, they could potentially drive significant portions of the invasion back into the sea. The night before the invasion, June 5th, Eisenhower visited with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne who would be among the first Americans into France. He shook hands, shared jokes, tried not to show the crushing weight of responsibility he carried. He knew that within 24 hours, many of these young men would be dead. He knew that if Operation Fortitude failed, if Hitler sent his reserves to Normandy too quickly, the casualties could be catastrophic. In a quieter moment, Eisenhower pulled out a small piece of paper and scribbled a message accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. He put the note in his wallet, ready to release it if everything went wrong. Then he climbed back into his staff car and returned to headquarters to wait. On the morning of June 6th, as dawn broke over Normandy, over 5,000 ships approached the French coast. 150,000 men prepared to storm 5 beaches across 50 miles of coastline. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Hitler's headquarters, German commanders received reports of the landings and immediately requested permission to move the panzer reserves from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy. These armored divisions were Germany's strategic reserve in France, the forces that could potentially turn the tide of battle if deployed quickly enough. Hitler ultimately refused to release them. He'd been awakened with news of the Normandy landings but dismissed them as likely a diversion. The real invasion, he insisted, would probably come at Calais. Patton's FUSAG was still in England. Hitler had spent years studying military history, prided himself on his strategic judgment, and he found it difficult to believe the Allies would position their most aggressive armored commander away from the main attack. Patton had to be preparing for Calais. The Normandy landings had to be designed to draw German reserves away from the real target. For crucial hours, he delayed releasing the panzers, insisting they remain in Pas-de-Calais and wait. On Omaha Beach, young American soldiers fought through hell. German machine guns turned the sand red. Men drowned under the weight of their own equipment. Bodies piled up at the waterline. For a few terrible hours, the invasion teetered on the edge of disaster. But the German mobile reserves didn't arrive in force. Hitler kept substantial units in Calais, concerned about Patton's Phantom Army. By the end of the first day, the Allies had their foothold. It was tenuous, far short of their objectives, but they were ashore and holding. Over the next days and weeks, they would expand that foothold, pushing inland, bringing more troops and supplies across the beaches, building the strength to break out of Normandy and race across France. But they maintained that foothold in part because Hitler kept significant forces in Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The Allies maintained the FUSAG deception for weeks after D-Day. The fake radio traffic continued. The double agents sent reports of Patton's army preparing to launch. The dummy tanks and landing craft remained in southeast England, ready to be photographed by German reconnaissance flights. Hitler kept substantial forces in Pas-de-Calais until late July, 7 weeks after the Normandy landings, still concerned that Patton would lead a follow-up invasion. When German intelligence finally realized they'd been deceived, when they finally understood that Normandy was the only major invasion and FUSAG was a phantom, it was too late. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, were approaching Paris, and were building momentum across France. And then finally, Eisenhower unleashed Patton for real. On August 1, 1944, Patton took command of the newly activated Third Army in France. Over the next month, his tanks would cover 500 miles, liberate tens of thousands of square miles of French territory, and capture tens of thousands of German prisoners. He drove his men harder and faster than any commander in the war, exactly the kind of aggressive, slashing, unstoppable advance that German planners had always anticipated from him. But by then the crucial battle had already been won, not by Patton's tanks but by his reputation, not by bullets and bombs but by make-believe. Years later, after the war, military historians would calculate that Operation Fortitude, the Phantom Army, the Patton deception, likely saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by keeping German reserves away from Normandy during the critical first days and weeks. These were soldiers who came home to their families because Hitler kept significant forces in the wrong place, waiting for an army that didn't exist. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that the deception was essential to the invasion's success. British intelligence officers who ran the operation called it one of the most consequential intelligence achievements of the war. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from the German side. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated German commanders, many of them admitted they had been deceived about Allied intentions. They had believed a major attack would come at Calais. They had believed Patton's presence indicated the main effort. They had believed the lie. One German general, when shown the evidence of how FUSAG was created, the dummy tanks, the false radio traffic, the turned spies, studied it all carefully and then said simply that they had never doubted Patton's army was real. They thought they knew where he was and what he was planning. That assessment, he acknowledged, had been a mistake. For Patton himself, The irony was bittersweet. He'd spent weeks in disgrace, then months commanding an army that didn't exist, sitting out what many consider the most important invasion in history while other generals received recognition. But those months of deception, those weeks of waiting while other men stormed the beaches, represented perhaps his greatest contribution to Allied victory. He'd done what he always wanted to do. He'd helped defeat the Germans. He'd changed the course of the war. He'd contributed to saving thousands of lives. He'd just done it in a way he never expected, not primarily with bullets and blood, but with reputation and deception, with an army that existed only in German intelligence assessments and Hitler's strategic calculations. The lesson of Operation Fortitude echoes across history. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest gun or the fastest tank. Sometimes it's not even real. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do isn't to fight your enemy where they expect, but to make them prepare for shadows while the real battle happens somewhere else. One general commanded a phantom army and never led a combat unit into battle during the invasion. Another leader believed the deception and positioned his forces to meet threats that weren't coming. And because he did, 150,000 young soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy had a better chance to establish a foothold and ultimately make it home. One of the most important battles of World War II was influenced before the first shot was fired by an elaborate deception that convinced Hitler to wait in the wrong place for the wrong army led by the right general who was never really coming at all.